Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I am Anthony Cosenza, as always, with you talking Bengals football, and we are on the precipice of the start of the 2017 regular season, and we are so excited. Scott Schulze, my co-host, is with me as always. Scott, how are you doing? Are you ready for week one? Do you have your plan set to watch the Bengals take on the Ravens?
Sadly, not yet. My mind is still trying to absorb all the Paw Patrol I've been watching over the past week.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness.
But I'm thinking of changing a couple.
Our guest, Matthew Cohen, is with Baltimore Beatdown, and he's a little bit more fresh-faced looking than you and I are, Scott. So I don't know if he knows about the whole Paw Patrol thing, but Matthew, good to have you with us. Again, Matthew is with SB Nation's Ravens site, Baltimore Beatdown. He's the editor there, and he's going to help us preview the upcoming season opener, Ravens at Bengals at Paul Brown Stadium. So for those of you who are joining us in the live YouTube chat, definitely, if you got some questions, let us know. And if you got some questions for Matthew, we'll relay those, but we've got some as well. Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we kind of dive into the whole 2017 season opener and how you kind of became a Ravens fan, how you got to work with SB Nation and Baltimore Beatdown.
Yeah, so again, thank you for having me on. As a Ravens fan, I kind of started out just my family on my mom's side is just from Baltimore. So I kind of grew up with the Ravens all around me. I was watching them as a kid, and just over time I grew up with, Ray Lewis, Ed Reed, some of those big defensive names, and it's stuck. In terms of coming to Baltimore Beatdown, this is my second year there. Around June of last year, I saw a tweet from the Baltimore Beatdown saying they were looking for new writers. So I applied, just sent some stuff from my high school paper, and lo and behold, I got the job. And here I am as an editor now. It's kind of been lucky to get such a great experience.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, obviously the SB Nation sports networks are full of great writers, editors, and Scott and I are patting ourselves on the back too, because we are a part of that. But glad to have you with us. And for you, you're pretty stoked. I mean, basically since the Ravens have been in existence, they've been competitive and/or champions. So you've watched you've watched a lot of quality football over the years, which is awesome. I'm just going to start off with kind of an obvious one, a question that obviously a lot of Bengals fans have on their mind, and it's about Joe Flacco, his herniated disc in his neck. There's been talk about, at least in the summer, there was talk about him potentially missing some regular season time. It doesn't look that way, correct?
Yes, that's correct. He returned to practice on Saturday, and today when the Ravens injury report came out, Flacco was listed as a full participant in practice. So all throughout the process, Coach John Harbaugh and everyone else around the Ravens have really tried to stay with their mantra that Flacco will be playing in week one, and it appears based on the practice schedule that he will be ready to go.
Awesome. I guess I should say not awesome for the Ravens, maybe not so much for the Bengals, but there's a lot of new faces now on this Ravens team, Matt, and mostly at least for me, at wide receiver. They added Jeremy Maclin. They still have Mike Wallace, who they've had for a little bit of time here. Brashad Perriman is a guy that they drafted a couple years ago and has yet to really make a big impact on this team. But Steve Smith's gone. Obviously, Torrey Smith from a few years ago is gone. There's kind of some turnover at the wide receiver position. Now, with Flacco not really practicing throughout the summer and training camp, you got a couple of new faces there at wide receiver. Is there concern there? How has Perriman looked? Kind of break down the wide receiver group for us, if you would.
So I would say there's, at least in my mind, slightly some concern, and that's only because Flacco hasn't really had enough time to gel and get chemistry with some of his new faces at the receiver group. Losing Steve Smith obviously hurts. It's, he's a potential Hall of Famer, probably a first ballot Hall of Famer. It's hard to lose a guy like that. But when you bring in someone like Jeremy Maclin, who I don't think you can say is on Steve Smith's level, but he's a really great receiver. He's been to Pro Bowls in the past. And while the Ravens will likely be using him in the slot instead of outside. He should be having a pretty big impact this year. He may well lead the team in targets. In terms of Perryman, he actually has had some injury setbacks too. He returned also on Saturday to practice. He missed, I think, the entire preseason. But during OTAs and mini camp stuff over the summer, he was one of the most impressive guys that we saw on Twitter every day. Was that, oh, Perryman was the most impressive. The highlights after practice was all that Perryman was making these incredible catches, big plays, and it garnered a lot of hype. And since he's missed so much time in the preseason, I think that kind of died down a bit. But now that he's back, I think it's time to start ramping the hype back up in terms of a potential breakout year. In terms of Wallace, Wallace was the team's leading receiver last year with he had 1,000 yards. I don't know if I can undoubtedly state he'll be the leading receiver this year. I think he's the favorite to be, just based on that he's still the number one receiver in the offense. Hopefully with Flacco now 2 years removed from his major knee injury, he'll be more able to take advantage of Mike Wallace's deep threat ability. And again, hopefully Flacco can now have chemistry with his new group of receivers. Obviously, that's a little bit of a concern considering Flacco missed the entire preseason, and considering how bad the offense looked during the preseason. I don't know how much you followed the Ravens preseason games, but they were bad. So it's going to be interesting to see how they perform this week.
So Matt, this is Scott Schulze. I have a question not so much about a specific person, but I guess as far as the team in general, because I know this series seems to be one that goes in runs where Bengals win a few, Baltimore wins a few. So looking back, the Bengals have won 6 of the last 7. So obviously as a Bengals fan, I would expect more of that. As a Ravens fan, I'm sure you're expecting that to change. So my question would be, what is it about the 2017 team that has Ravens fans excited saying, that streak is ending and this is why?
That streak is going to end because the Baltimore Ravens are getting back to what they were founded on, and that's defense. Well, while the offense, I was saying, really underwhelmed during the preseason, the defense was spectacular. And this was a unit that finished 7th in total defense last year, I believe. I think that's right. And they got better. They brought in, you talked about the wide receiver additions. They brought in a lot on defense. They re-signed Brandon Williams. They brought in Tony Jefferson, who, based on Pro Football Focus's grading system, was a top 5 safety in the NFL. They brought in first-round cornerback Marlon Humphrey. They brought in Brandon Carr. Marlon Humphrey was drafted in the first round. He's not even going to start this year. The secondary is one of the deepest the Ravens have ever had. But while the secondary is exciting because it's deep and has guys that are going to produce, it's the front 7 that really, more than anything, has people excited. It's one of the deepest units in the NFL, and it was the biggest reason why the Ravens finished the preseason first in total defense. It's everyone has talent, and everyone is going to be expected to produce.
This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza, joined by my co-host Scott Schulze, and we are talking with Matthew Cohen of Baltimore Beatdown, the SB Nation Ravens site. Good to have him with us. You talked just now about a lot of the secondary additions and all of that. Not to puff out the chest necessarily about the Bengals, their recent success, but AJ Green has been a maniac against Baltimore.
Absolutely.
And I believe I read today in the last 5 games he has 6 touchdowns, something to that effect. 3 100-yard games, including one that was close to 230 yards receiving. I'm assuming that the additions of Jefferson and Carr, obviously the team wants to shore up the secondary in general, but I would assume that Green is probably a big focus. Now, how has Carr looked? He's been a guy who will probably be – he signed a big deal with the Cowboys, didn't really ever materialize there. He had a couple years we didn't have any interceptions. I think he's had 1 interception the last 3 years, but he'll probably be tasked with covering A.J. Green at least some of the time on Sunday. How has he looked, and do you feel that he is up to the task to at least contain A.J. Green?
So I think in terms of covering AJ Green, you're going to see more of Jimmy Smith covering him.
Okay.
I think the Ravens are still committed to having him as the number one corner. AJ Green's one of those guys that you can't stop. You can only hope to contain him. And if the Ravens can contain him, then they'll have a great chance to win this game. The biggest thing that Jimmy Smith has to do is he has to, they're going to double team AJ Green just because John Ross now doesn't seem like he's going to play based on the reports that I've seen. And that gives the Ravens, I would think, more freedom to double team AJ Green as with Tyler Boyd and Tyler Eifert being the main other targets. You're going to see, safety help, but it's going to be, I think it's the matchup that could decide this game, because if the Ravens are able to slow him down and force the Bengals to look to the other options or run the ball, which is playing right into the Ravens' strength, that's what's going to give them the best chance to win, which is something that, and again, I don't have the stats on this right off the top of my head, but I don't recall the last time the Ravens have ever won at Cincinnati. It's been, they have won there, but it's been a while.
It has, and obviously the team the Bengals in the last 6 matchups, I believe, are 5-1 against Baltimore, and but we'll ask you this later in terms of a prediction of the score and outcome. But as you probably know, I always coin this, especially because of what's happened the last 3, 4, 5 years in this series. I always coin this series as kind of expect the unexpected. There's Hail Marys that end up being caught. There's Steve Smith that have caught big balls that, and the games go back and forth, and they've been a lot of fun to watch. Selfishly speaking, since the Bengals have been winning more often recently, it's been more fun that way. But in general, for two teams that usually have pretty stout defenses, there's been kind of an offensive explosion at times and weird plays that have happened. So it's been fun to watch in that respect. We did get a question for you in our live YouTube chat, and for those of you who are joining us live, if you've got a question for Matt, he's going to be here a few more minutes. If you want to have those asked on air, we'll ask him those. But Sudesh Nair asks, who is the lead running back? And I'll kind of add to that, just how is the running game going to look for the Ravens this year? They don't have necessarily the big names, but they've got some good guys up front, and they always seem to make it work, so to speak.
So coming into the preseason, the top guy everyone was talking about was Kenneth Dixon. He's now out for the season with a knee injury. That happened late July. So as a result, now the Ravens kept 3 running backs on the 53-man roster. That'd be Terrence West, Danny Woodhead, and Javarius Allen. Of those 3, the lead back's going to be Terrence West. West was the leading rusher last year, and he probably will be again this year. I think it's going to be by committee system. I really kind of just want to see how they're going to do it in week 1, because none of those 3 backs really got a lot of playing time together in the preseason. So it wasn't particularly easy to judge how they're going to be used in the regular season, but it's going to be a lot of Terrence West on running downs, and Danny Woodhead obviously is going to be on passing downs. From the Ravens last year, the new offensive coordinator, Ronnie Mornhinweg, now in his 2nd season, hopefully will look to run the ball a bit more after Baltimore led the NFL in passes last year, which the Ravens throwing the ball more times than anyone in the NFL is not the path to success. It's running the ball. So if they can, grind it a bit with Terrence West and keep some of those dump off plays from last year, but use Danny Woodhead instead for those, who's one of the elite running backs in terms of screen passes, that's how I see it going. I think you're going to see Buck Allen, Javarius Allen get some touches in there. He's the 3rd string back, and the 3rd string back for a good reason. But it's going to be Terrence West getting the most of the carries, but still in a committee format.
Matt, this is Scott Schulze again. Actually, I was going to ask you about the running backs. That was a good question. So I'm going to, I'm going to go with something maybe a little more odd or deeper. Because I'm a big fan of the draft. A couple years ago, I remember this really highly regarded tight end named Max Williams, who there was a lot of hype regarding, great blocker, great receiver. I think he's now in his third year with the Ravens, second-round pick. Last time I looked at the depth chart, he seems to be way down there. What exactly is up? Is he going to become the next Tyler Eifert, the next Gronkowski, or was he? Did it just not work out for him, or is it injuries? I guess I'm just curious. Whatever happened with this guy who had been hyped so much?
I think it's a combination of injuries, but also that he's just never really lived up to the potential that he's been thought to have. This year in the Week 1 depth chart, the Ravens put Nick Boyle as the starting tight end. Williams had some pretty big plays in the preseason. He showed that's probably some of the biggest flashes we've seen from him, but I don't think he's ever lived up to the potential that everyone thought he was going to have in terms of a elite tight end. With Dennis Pitta now gone, you may see more from him this year than you ever saw from him in the past, giving him probably the best chance he's ever had to have a breakout season. And hopefully he's able to do so because the Ravens really need someone to step up at tight end and be their reliable option.
Talking with Matt Cohen of Baltimore Beatdown, SB Nation's Ravens site. This is the Orange and Black Insider with Anthony Cosenza and Scott Schulze. Just a couple more questions, and then we'll get you out of here, Matt. Adrian Vallejo, by the way, Scott did echo in the live YouTube chat, did echo your question there, asking who's the Ravens' number one tight end. Obviously going along the same lines as Max William there. James Napke in the YouTube chat has a good Matt, you kind of talked about the Ravens defense and how they've really kind of tried to rebuild that defense into what, they were with that star-studded lineup of Ed Reed, Ray Lewis that you mentioned earlier. The Bengals are probably going to be without about 4 starters on defense. Obviously, Vontaze Burfict, one of their best players on defense, is out with a suspension. Adam Jones, one of their best corners, is out with a suspension. A couple other guys, that are looking to be nicked up and whatnot. But is that something, when you look at the Bengals defense and you look at the Ravens offense, is that something that you hope or you think that the Ravens can take advantage of with a guy like Woodhead in the passing game, maybe open up play action for the deep ball?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's something that Ravens are going to definitely do. I think they'd be, crazy not to take advantage of some of the weaknesses that the Bengals may have this weekend. Whether it's, in the passing game with Adam Jones not being there, or trying to run the ball more with Burfict not being in the middle of the field and not with all his crazy hits. But we'll see. It's something that I hope the Ravens will be able to do, and I think it's maybe one of the keys to them winning the game if that is their final result.
We're talking again with Matt Cohen of Baltimore Beatdown, the SB Nation site. Matt, I guess before we kind of get and my colleague may have one more question for you as well, but what do you think the biggest key is for this week's game? Is it in terms of the Ravens having success going into Cincinnati and winning this game? Is it shutting down A.J. Green? Is it shutting down Tyler Eifert in the red zone? Is it clamping down on the run game? Is it being able to make those big plays in the passing game on offense? What do you think, if you were to really say this is the one thing the Ravens need to do in order to win this game?
The one thing the Ravens need to do to win this game is we know that the defense is going to perform. I think that's something that a lot of Ravens fans are going to the game just assuming. But the biggest key is, can Flacco get the chemistry with his receivers despite limited time to get that chemistry? If he's able to, because again, as I mentioned earlier, during the preseason, the Ravens offense was absolutely terrible with Ryan Mallett at the helm, who is the backup quarterback. So if Flacco is able to get any kind of chemistry, get the offense rolling, it's going to be a huge improvement. And the Ravens were able to go 4-0 in the preseason. And yes, it's the preseason. I get it. But the defense was so good that they were able to overcome a terrible offense. If the offense is able to click a little more with Flacco at the helm, I think that should be enough to win a regular season game instead of a watered-down preseason one.
Understandable, and some of the other listeners that are tuning in live are saying, based on I don't know how familiar you are with the Bengals offensive line situation, but a lot of people seem to think that if the Ravens can get to Andy Dalton, they can force turnovers, force pressure. The Bengals lost 2-star offensive linemen this year in free agency, which hurts. So there's a little inexperienced up front. And Dalton may be getting a little skittish if he gets pressure. So, Matt, I know you've got your Ravens sweater on. I see the logo. We're going to get you out of here with this. How do you see this one playing out? What's your prediction on this game? I did see that James Napke in our live YouTube chat did say it should be close. He's calling 24-23 Bengals. I tend to agree that it's going to be close either way, but what do you think?
I 100% agree on that. I think it's going to be a very close game. Honestly, I think it's a coin flip on who wins the game because the Bengals have losses on defense and offense that are going to hurt them, but the Ravens still have a lot of offensive question marks. I think at the end of the day, I really think this is going to come down to who has the ball last, and at that point, who has the best kicker. And if it comes to that, I gotta go with Baltimore. Because we do have the best kicker there. I think if it's going to come down to a last-second field goal, I want Tucker kicking it. And I think that's what's going to come down to. I guess if I have to give a score prediction, I don't know. That's tough. I would say somewhere around 24-21 Ravens.
Yeah, that's
low scoring.
It's probably going to be the occasional big play with a lot of 3-and-outs mixed in for both teams. And like you said, it very well may come down to the kicking game. And the Bengals kicking game is it's interesting at the moment, to say the least. So, Matt, thanks for coming on. Appreciate it. Where can people find your work aside from? Yeah, absolutely. Where can people find you on Twitter? Where can people find your work aside from at Baltimore Beatdown? I think you do some stuff for the Washington Nationals I saw as well.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at MDC_99. In terms of the Nationals thing you mentioned, I've been writing for a Maryland sports blog. It's mostly a high school sports blog, but I've just been contributing some other stuff. So I've been their Washington Nationals writer. I've also been working for a local newspaper, which I seriously doubt anyone in Cincinnati cares about, but you can get awesome. To all my stories from there. And then on Baltimore Beatdown as well. Everything's on my Twitter if you want to find my stuff. Awesome.
Well, I appreciate the time. I know we had a little hiccup getting you on here, but I appreciate you dealing with that and coming on. And maybe if you're willing and able, maybe we'll have you on towards the end of the year to talk about the rematch between the Bengals and Ravens.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me.
All right. Appreciate it. That was Matthew Cohen with Baltimore Beatdown, the SB Nation Ravens site. Awesome insight. Obviously, a huge game coming up. And not just because it's week 1 and the Bengals are looking to redeem themselves, but it's a divisional game. You start the season out at home. It's a team that the Bengals have had a lot of success against lately. So big game there. Scott, what are a couple of your keys to victory? I mean, we've talked extensively with Matt now about the game and the outlook of the game. We'll get to our predictions at the end of the show, but what are a couple of your keys to this week as the Bengals host the Ravens to open the season?
Well, I mean, Matt really nailed one with Justin Tucker. I mean, he is a phenomenal kicker, and I know Bullock won the our competition, whatever we want to call it, with him and Jake Elliott, and still we have somehow we have both in the roster, one on the practice squad, one. So I guess one key is to keep Baltimore from crossing the 50-yard line, to keep Justin Tucker out of field goal range. Short of that, I think the other key is anything we can do to build a big lead. I mean, really go aggressive, push the ball early, because especially with Flacco being out for a while, this is probably the best chance. I know he's a big arm kind of guy. If you can and they have those deep receivers, someone like Mike Wallace, but the timing's probably not there. They're probably several weeks behind from where they should be if he had been there all training camp. So they're probably going to be able to run because they like to run. They may not. They have the big guys, the Marchionda. They're going to want to pound the ball if they can get the lead. That's what they're going to want to do. Probably kill the clock. But if we can somehow just really push it offensively, get aggressive, get some sort of lead, get big turnovers, and just really try to build lead, force them to throw the ball with a passing game that the hope isn't in sync yet. Rashad Perriman's obviously not become a great elite receiver. Maybe at some point he will be worth the first round pick, but as of yet, he has not really earned that. Macklin is new. They have new pieces there with a quarterback who's been hurt all training camp. So you kind of think, okay, there's probably going to be a few things there they have to work out and tweak. So if you can force them to throw in a passing game that probably isn't quite in sync yet, to me that'd be the biggest thing you can do is just build that lead, force them to throw, hopefully get some pressure with some of these young guys like Jordan Willis and Carl Lawson, along with Dunlap.
You melded them together. You melded them together. I like that.
Well, they're so good. They just become
one ultimate defensive lineman. I like it.
Yes, and Dunlap Atkins on the other side.
Yeah, there you go. Gino Dunlap, yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I'd say that's the biggest thing. Anything we can do to build that lead to really force them to throw in a passing game is probably not going to be in sync yet. And hopefully that leads to a bigger lead because they're off cue. You're trying to force them to throw when maybe they're not ready to throw. Really throwing that new pressure we have at them, which they haven't seen from the Bengals in a while. That kind of pressure. So for me, that off the top of my head, I'd say that's the not the only key, but definitely a key.
Yeah, and for me, I look at a couple of things, and I agree with you on one of the aspects, but I'm going to take it a little further. I think if the Bengals can take care of that short stuff, the dump-offs to Woodhead, the dump-offs to the backs, the little crossing route, Flacco's a really interesting NFL quarterback to me. It's either huge bomb down the sideline or down the middle of the field or check down, check down, check down, check down, check down. And when he has a running back who can catch the ball, can make plays in space, that's where Flacco really has a nice security blanket. If the Bengals, without Perfect and and Sean Williams at safety, a couple of others, if they can get that stuff, minimize the damage from those type of plays, all of a sudden then that doesn't open up anything deep because the rest of the defense is, it puts the Ravens offense into a 3rd and long type of situation, and the Bengals defense is ready to pounce and is, capable against a long passing play that they're pretty much certain of seeing. So I think if they kind of can limit some of that stuff, limit the damage from the running backs in the passing game, I think that will really rattle Flacco. And then obviously, the Bengals, they don't blitz that much in terms of bringing extra guys because what they do is they have a lot of good guys up front and they mix them around and they say, our corners are going to be kind of on an island a little bit and we're going to get to your quarterback without blitzing guys and we're going to use the rest of the guys in space and try and help out there. So I think if they're able to kind of utilize that game plan, get to Flacco, keep everything in front, I think that's key. And then obviously the young cornerbacks that are filling in for Adam Jones are key. Darquez Dennard seems to be a top, which was a little surprising because, Scott, you and I talked about the whole – I think we had a question a week or two ago from one of our listeners about, is it Jackson or is it Dennard? A lot of things we had been hearing and seeing was that Jackson was going to be there. And if you saw the recent release of the depth chart, it's Dennard that's atop the right cornerback spot and not Jackson. Did that surprise you at all?
It does. I mean, I'm kind of hoping that, at least based on what we've seen on preseason and what we've seen from Dennard in the last few years, that is more just Marvin saying, hey, I like my veterans, I'm going to put them on top, and not so much that's who I'm going to start, which we can probably get into that later. But yeah, it did surprise me just based on the fact I assume you want to win and you're not just wanting to put all the veterans on top. So I think everything all Bengals fans have seen from the preseason, William Jackson III looked like the guy that was probably going to be the starting outside cornerback over Dennard.
we've already got our first, at least that I've seen, our first, I don't know if you want to call it a bold prediction or a whatever you want to call it, from Adrian Vallejo, says Chris Smith will deliver the first sack for the Bengals this year. So not Geno, not Carlos Dunlap, not Michael Johnson. It's going to be Chris Smith coming off the edge, according to Adrian, to get the first sack of the Bengals season. I mean, we're going to talk about news and notes and stuff. I guess we can kind of segue this into that with the depth chart talk. Any other surprises? Go ahead.
As I said, there was one. I mean, you had a really good point, I think, about the safeties and Burfict being out.
Okay.
As far as covering, the tight end, and regardless of who's playing tight end, if it's Max Williams or the 36, 46, however old he is, starter they have there, Ben Watts, whoever they grab off the street to play tight end, we just don't seem to cover them well. And with Burfict out, I look at out, Sean Williams. That does become a concern. Last year, the Bengals were 17th in the NFL in third down conversions on defense, at just under 40% allowed. And, that's the kind of thing where, that's the perfect spot for something like that. You dump it off to Danny Woodhead, who, for whatever reason, he doesn't look the part, but he always seems to, make those catches and convert. So, yeah, I think that's going to be a big thing is, can Vinny Ray, can Nick Vigil, they talk about Nick Vigil as being, a decent speed guy who can, you don't have to take off on third down. Can those guys cover when it comes down to it? Can they, or are they just going to let the guy, basically position himself in front of them, get the 5 down catch, 5 yard, not 5 down. This isn't, I guess, Colorado. 5 down. Never mind.
I understand. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, we're both old enough.
Let's actually back up. For those of you that didn't understand that reference, this is something from the 90s. I believe it was mid-90s, and this was University of Colorado. Rashawn Salam, Michael Westbrook, and I believe Cordell Stewart were all on the same team. So there's your little sports knowledge. Go look up University of Colorado 5 downs. That's the reference Scott made. Scott, I got you, buddy. I got you.
And I think they got a national title because of that, because the Big 12 officials gave them that 5th down.
They did.
Anyway, stopping those 4th downs, because every little, because when you have a kicker as good as Justin Tucker, I mean, any little 5-10 yard, you give him our set downs, you give him 10 yards, you keep letting him get closer, well, you're in field goal range. And I know someone commented in our YouTube chat how great it would be to have someone like Tucker, and two kickers. Hopefully, we can combine them together and get Tucker. I don't know if we can get Randy Elliott or Jake Bullock to somehow become Tucker, but yeah. Long story short, I totally agree with what you're saying about stopping those third down conversions with the little dump offs with all those guys out.
Yeah, and,
that's what I'm trying to say.
Wait, Scott bringing the humor, the historical perspective. I love it. James Napke says a hot fudge Sunday says Bullock has at least one miss, and if you've looked at Randy Bullock, he's probably had a couple of hot fudge Sundays in his day. No offense, Randy. And then, as you mentioned, Justin Tabor says, could you imagine having a kicker like Justin Tucker, not having to stress about extra points and anything under 55 yards? Yeah, we haven't had that for a while. And I love this key from Royal Flush 513, a loyal listener. Good to see them back in the YouTube chat. And do not drop interceptions or miss fumble recovery opportunities. And unfortunately, Vincent Ray, as much as I like the guy as a human being and as a Charlie Hustle type of player and a guy that the Bengals like, he's made some egregious errors in this area. The wild card game against Pittsburgh comes to mind. He had another 1 or 2 last season. And those are the differences in games. And if you look especially at the Bengals in 2016, some of those games were very close. When you don't catch the interceptions, even if it's early in the game, you don't really think back to it. That's a big play. When you don't convert extra points, field goals, those are big plays. Those are the difference between wins and losses. And hopefully that's not going to be the issue with the Bengals this year. Kind of harping on with what you're saying, and you know, I don't want to go too long on this, but you're completely right about the linebackers. You talked about Nick Vigil. You talked about Vinny Ray. Vigil was a guy, if you remember, the coaches really liked Emmanuel Lemur. And Emmanuel Lemur was this speedy guy, this rangy guy who, was going to be the next big, good cover nickel linebacker for this team. He had a couple of interceptions for the team when he finally got the starting gig. I believe it was in 2014. But other than that, never really materialized, landed with Zimmer in Minnesota. To your point, Scott, the Bengals for a long time struggled covering tight ends. It got a lot better under Zimmer towards the end of his reign as the defensive coordinator with the Bengals, and it really has started to kind of drop again. You notice that if you really want proof, go back to that Patriots game last year where Gronkowski and Martellus Bennett absolutely torched the Bengals in that game. So you're right. Whether it's Max Williams, whether it's Ben Watson, whether it's Nick Boyle, the Bengals are going to need to find an answer to get tight ends under wraps. When Sean Williams was injured in the preseason, you saw a couple of guys step in. Granted, it may or may not have been their assignments, but all of a sudden the Chiefs, a backup tight end has 2 touchdown catches in that game. So these are guys that are going to be playing. Josh Shaw, Darren Smith. So they need to step up, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think without that, everyone needs to step up. I mean, all the new players, Randy Bullock obviously needs to start making kicks in the regular season that count. You obviously hope Pat Sims steps up now that he's considered a starter. You know, Nick Vigil, Vinny Ray, Trey Hopkins now that he's a starter. But I guess I'm getting too far ahead into our next segment. But to your point, yeah, especially with all
no,
this.
It's good. It's a good segue. It's a good segue.
I mean, long story short, basically everyone needs to step up. I mean, you kind of know what you're going to get from the veterans. The thing you don't know is what are you going to get from all the new faces. Now that Tyler Boyd has a bigger role, now that you have a kicker who they've kind of thrown their hat in with, they kind of picked up off the street last year and said, nope, this is our guy. Forget the 5th-round pick. We're going with this guy. Or we love Andre Smith. We've had him forever with this love-hate relationship ever since we drafted him. Forget that. We're now going with Trey Hopkins. And, some of these other decisions they've made, you kind of hope that these guys are going to produce in the regular season like they do in the preseason. And, Joe Mixon, the guy we love to talk about and who we would give the ball to 40 times a game if we could. You hope you don't see a fumble like you did in the Washington preseason game, and you hope that everything you've seen in the preseason as far as those little flashes emerge.
Yeah. It's a good segue to what we're going to talk about. Again, this is going to be we're just going to kind of give some news and notes here with the Bengals. First things first, before we talk about the depth chart that was recently released, Scott, first things first, it looks as if, per reports from Ian Rappaport and maybe some others, that John Ross, rookie wide receiver who injured himself in the finale against the Colts in the preseason, it looks like he may miss the first 1 or 2 games. It's probably unlikely that he will be suiting up against the Ravens, maybe against the Texans, but that's a short week. So most likely what the Bengals will do, at least as we sit here now, they will probably rest him for those 2 games, let him get that mini bye under his belt, and then bring him back week 3 against the Packers. We'll see if that is actually the case. Another interesting move that the Bengals made, it seemed as if Paul Denner Jr. from the Cincinnati Enquirer said, the Bengals weren't going to do anything until after week 1 in terms of additions. They obviously sent Jeff Driscoll to the injured reserve. And what they've done then is they've claimed off of waivers defensive tackle Christian Ringo off from the Green Bay Packers. He went to University of Louisiana Lafayette. He kind of had some decent Pro Football Focus. He was on the all preseason team, whatever that means to you. But he's a guy that he's 6'1", 298, and it's kind of interesting to me, Scott, and this kind of feeds into the depth chart conversation. It's interesting to me. The Bengals let go of David Dean, a guy that showed some promise. Obviously, couple weeks ago, they let go of Brandon Thompson, a guy who had been injured with the team and just, wasn't really making hay with the team. And then they have Deshaun Williams, who they cut and placed on the practice squad. And now they bring in this young man, Ringo, and he kind of leapfrogs Deshaun Williams in terms of defensive tackle and on the Bengals final roster or active roster, if you will. The Bengals were a little thin at defensive tackle. They only had 4 total. So now this young man comes in. What are your thoughts on this move and the fact that they kind of let Deshaun Williams still sit on the practice squad?
I think one thing, as far as Bengals fans who kind of follow the team and know more than Green and Dalton seem to have an interest in Deshaun Williams and also Marcus Hardison as kind of those diamonds in the rough, those guys who kind of flashed some upside, had some good college tape. And now both of them are gone, and they bring in this kid from Green Bay, and you kind of it's kind of one of those things that makes you wonder if he's the very last guy, and you have Jones and Burfict out, that he's probably not going to be on the roster more than a week or a couple weeks until those guys come back. So I guess I don't have too much of a thought on it, only because he's probably going to be very short-lived. But that being the case, it does kind of say something that they liked him or felt he was worth putting on there, instead of Marcus Hardison or Deshaun Williams, both who have been with the Bengals organization for a little while. Seemed like they might finally get their chance this year to push for that roster spot. And now they're both not on the 53-man roster.
Yeah, Ringo was a 6th-round pick during the 2015 draft, so he's been around for a couple of seasons. And the Bengals obviously like what they saw out of him. And, I think we knew at some point that the Bengals what they came out with on Labor Day weekend in terms of their 53-man roster or their active roster wasn't going to be the same thing that we saw almost going into week 1 or maybe even a couple weeks in. The Bengals may decide that they don't like a couple of spots. They need to deepen up some spots. And obviously with Adam Jones returning, Vontaze Burfict returning from suspensions, there's probably going to be some guys let go there as well. Scott, with the release of the depth chart, I mean, there's not a ton of surprises, but I guess there's a couple for some. And the 2 big ones, you mentioned it earlier, Pat Sims being the other starting defensive tackle next to Geno Atkins, leapfrogging Andrew Billings there. Ryan Glasgow is backing up Geno Atkins, and then obviously they brought in this kid Ringo to kind of back up as well. And then the other surprise for some, maybe not to many, Joe Mixon is the 3rd running back behind Jeremy Hill and Giovanni Bernard on the depth chart. Are you surprised at Sims and Mixon, who kind of are the 2 that stood out on the depth chart? With the release of the depth chart for the first time of the season.
I'd say for me, I can't say I'm surprised at all. Back when they drafted Mixon, I guess ever since then, my tune I've been unfortunately singing is he is without a doubt the most talented running back. He is also going to be their 3rd string running back. And I think a lot of people are kind of hopeful that at some point during the season, he moves up to number 2, moves up to number 1. I am still in the mindset that happens sometime next year. I think he's going to get a ton of touches, but I think so are Bernard and so are Hill as long as they're healthy. Just because we've talked about it many times in the past, Marvin is a man who favors veterans. All things being equal, he will always side with a proven commodity who may not have as much upside, may not even do as much on the field, over a guy who has a little more upside, probably a little better producer, but is a younger player. Unless he absolutely is forced to go with the younger guys. Case in point being A.J. Green, Andy Dalton, their rookie years. He had no choice. The quarterback had said he wasn't going to play for him anymore. All they had was Bruce Gradkowski. They had to put in whoever they grabbed, which turned out to be Dalton that year. So, all things being equal, I wouldn't be surprised. I think Mixon will probably have a few games where he probably leads the team in touches, and he's probably going to have some amazing highlight plays. But I just don't see a Marvin Lewis-led team letting Mixon, especially early in the year, even at all this year, really take over like we want him to be a guy who touches the ball 15, 20 times a game. And then the thing with Sims and Billings, that doesn't entirely surprise me because as much as fans were stoked to see Billings fall to the Bengals and get drafted last year, another thing to consider is he did fall to them. There is obviously a reason. He seems to be a guy who has a ton of upside, ton of power, but still working some on the technique. A lot of the reports out of training camp and out of the preseason games are, yeah, this dude's strong, but he still needs to refine that pass rush technique so he just doesn't try to run through people. And that being the case, it's not a absolute, Sims is horrible, Billings is great. It's a Billings is the future. He has the upside. He's not quite there yet. So I can see why Marvin Lewis would side with Sims. That being said, they're probably going to rotate 50-50, and on passing downs, you may not see either one in there. They may do something different. But I will say the thing that surprised me the most. Well, actually, I want to skip the thing the thing that surprised me the most was keeping a second fullback, Ethan Carter. I have to admit, I write for Cincy Jungle. I've been doing this podcast. I should know everything. I generally know every player, when they were drafted, where they came from. I had no clue who he was. So if he's listening, I'm sorry. I know who you are now. A week ago, I had never. Yeah, I don't know how. Somehow I'd never heard of this guy until last week.
Yeah, Ethan Carter, undrafted guy out of the University of Nebraska. I actually saw some good things from him in the preseason, and in some conversations we had internally at Cincy Jungle, I actually said, hey, this guy actually looks pretty good. I thought he was definite practice squad material, not necessarily active roster material, but athletic, can catch the ball. I think they listed him behind Ryan Hewitt as that H-back, but I think he also has tight end capabilities as well. Just another talented pass catcher for the Bengals and Andy Dalton. And I said the one reason why this Ethan Carter makes sense, him on the active roster, you look at Eifert, God love him. He's a great player, gets hurt a lot. CJ Uzoma, he's hurt. We don't know what his status is going into the beginning of this season right now. He's nursing an injury. It seemed as if, even though it was kind of early in the preseason and training camp, seemed as if it was somewhat significant to keep him out. So that's a position. And regardless of those guys being quote unquote injury prone, that position just in general takes a beating, that tight end position. And so, they've got another talented pass catcher, not as big as Uzoma or Eifert, but definitely can catch the ball. Made some nice plays in the preseason, and I think he could be a decent little addition. And I don't want to talk about a guy's future or lack thereof with the club, but he could be one of those first guys, unfortunately, that gets the axe when Burfict and Jones kind of come back from their suspensions. But those are some of the things we noticed about the depth chart, and obviously some other news and notes with the Bengals that are going on as we head into week 1. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. As for those of you who are new, you can check us out on iTunes, on SoundCloud, on YouTube. You can join us live every episode at cincyjungle.com or YouTube as well. We have a live chat with a lot of different Bengals fans that tune in. You can interact with them. And, if you got some questions, we usually like to try and do listener questions at the end of the show. We'll probably have time for maybe one or two tonight. So send those over. We'll be scanning those. We're also on Twitter at BengalsOBI, and you can get in touch with us via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. Before we move on to our next quick segment, Scott, you've got one more point about the roster that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, just real quick, and I'm very curious what your thoughts are. And this is one that anyone who's reading my stuff or listened to me on the podcast knows where I stand on this issue, and that would be the kicker. I was definitely in the Jake Elliott camp, so I can't say I was totally surprised.
Even after the Colts game.
Yeah, all the way through. I just it's kind of like spring training. Okay. You have a career 200 hitter who all of a sudden is hitting 450 with 5 home runs in spring training. Do you start him over Joey Votto? I mean, granted, I'm not saying Elliott was Votto, but the point is, that seemed what this decision was. Hey, this guy got hot at the right time. We are throwing him in. We don't care what his track record is. We're going to ride this hot hand and hope it lasts more than a month. And I get that. I totally get that. And he's a veteran. I know they want to go with the veteran. They had him last year, so they like the continuity. I just think Elliott has way too much upside, and I was glad he was able to make it through waivers and end up on the roster as a practice squad candidate, which obviously doesn't protect him, but at least it has him sitting there. I don't think the Bengals would call him up unless, Randy Bullock does something crazy like jumps and pulls a hamstring while celebrating a kick or misses like 10 kicks in a row. So he probably ends the year on another team's roster. But that being said, I guess that was the one everyone, I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are. Are you pleased with the decision, or would you go another way?
On the kicker?
Yes.
Well, I'm pleased the way it worked out that Elliott landed back on the practice squad. That way you have a veteran guy to start the season, and if Bullock turns into the guy that he has always been and who he wasn't in the preseason, if he turns into that guy, then what you do is you say bye-bye and you bring the rookie up and you let him be your kicker for better or for worse, probably for the rest of the year. So I'm pleased that the Bengals still have some flexibility and options there. I think for now, and why Elliott landed on the practice squad was because guys like Nick Novak, I believe it was Cody Parkey was another, some other veterans, obviously Roberto Aguayo, some other names were out on the waiver wire, and so teams just kind of said, we don't need to, he was kind of an afterthought. So while I'm not thrilled with Randy Bullock as the Bengals kicker this year, and while I'm not thrilled that Jake Elliott lost, quote unquote, the competition, I am glad that the Bengals can, and I hope they exercise a short leash with Randy Bullock, because if last year taught him anything, and if this year is going to be the same thing, you can't sacrifice games by 2-3 points or less, and because of a kicker. So I'm not totally pleased with Randy Bullock being the team's kicker, but the Bengals have flexibility there and can bring Elliott back up, which I am pleased about. One other little roster note, the Bengals, and I guess this speaks both to the strength of the upper part of their rookie class. The Bengals let go of, they IR'd one of their picks in Mason Schreck, their seventh round tight end, and they cut 3 others. Now, granted, they got back Elliott and Brandon Wilson, the safety that they cut, back on the practice squad. That's good news. J.J. Dielman, the offensive lineman, the lone offensive lineman that the Bengals took in this year's draft, got picked up by the Rams off of waivers. So the Bengals, though their draft was a bit top-heavy, it is a shame to see some of their lower round picks, not really materialize on the active roster. I would say, and I want to get your quick opinion before we move on, Scott, I will say that I think the Bengals made a mistake because they weren't active in outside free agency and they didn't, do the high price signings that way. I think the Bengals, and even internally because they let 2 of their offensive linemen go, but I think the Bengals did a disservice to their team to not potentially package some of those picks, move back up in maybe the 4th round or so, if they were able to. Now, granted, we don't know the details and if they tried that or if they, if that was a possibility, but you would think with the amount of picks they had at the end of the draft and maybe even some early ones down the road, you would think that they would maybe package up and move up and maybe get a more desirable offensive lineman. Granted, hindsight's 2020, so hard to say, but I guess my point is, Scott, if you're not going to be aggressive in free agency, they told us all offseason that the draft was their focus. They were going to draft. They also told us that all 11 picks weren't going to make the roster. So why wouldn't you be more aggressive in the draft, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that some people rightly bring up when they talk about the Bengals refusing to pursue free agents, because the Bengals are a team we build through the draft. We keep our own guys. We don't sign free agents because we want those comp picks. And then you get, a pick number 150 or 180, end of the 4th round, end the 5th round. And they had so many this year. Okay, you're drafting 10, 11 guys. You don't have a roster like the Browns where you need to draft 17 people and keep them all. You have some holes, but not that many. So you're not going to be able to use all the guys. And you look back and think, well, why can't we sacrifice, one of these late 5th round picks to go grab a guy who's going to be a starter? Because what are the odds that, some guy you draft the end of the 4th, 5th, 6th round is going to become a starter? Probably not that high. But if you sign a guy that costs you that pick in the compensation draft equation, that's what you're getting. So you're refusing to sign a guy in free agency who can get you, be a starter level guy, maybe not a great starter, but they can get a starter. And instead they we want the pick, and then they use it for it doesn't seem to give them a lot. It's kind of like at the end of the day, do you want a nice Culver's concrete mixer or a Dairy Queen Blizzard, or like 10 gallons of like bulk generic vanilla ice cream? Your stomach's only so big. You can only eat so much before it melts. It does you no good to get the truck, have the big truck deliver 10 gallons of that ice cream, because it's going to go bad before you get through it. Why not get the thing you can actually use and enjoy and like? So I guess I totally agree.
Scott Schulze, our resident dessert aficionado. Okay, so if you're new to this program, Scott Schulze really likes him some desserts. So if you run into Scott, if you live in Ohio, you run into Scott, go buy him a Blizzard. I think you'll make his week. He's big on those. But no, I understand your point. I definitely understand your point. And it's the Bengals do things their way. I guess I just get a little frustrated in that, hey, look, if you're not going to spend money on, to me, whether or not you thought Andrew Whitworth was worth the money based on his age and maybe a slight decline in production, which is debatable. If you're not going to spend the money on a guy like that who should undoubtedly retire a Bengal, if you're not going to go spend the money on some outside guys that are, maybe premier or second tier type of players that are immediate plug and play starters in free agency, fine. I mean, I'm not pleased about it, but fine. But if you're going to harp on this draft strategy, to me, I don't mind if you hoard those picks, but this isn't a roster that needed 11 players. This is a roster that needed, say, 7 or 8 higher quality players instead of 11 players. And now you see guys that are, not on the active roster, on IR. Hindsight's 2020. I get it. But, then, they trade away a guy like Ben Wickery for a 2019 conditional pick. They traded Marquise Flowers for a 2018 pick. So now they're accumulating more picks. And, I don't know if I see this as a roster that needs so many more guys on this roster, so many new guys on the roster. It's more, I just would rather see them go quality over quantity and maybe not have that conservative approach in the draft if that's where they're going to primarily focus. That's me. I think you and I are a little bit on the same page there, Scott. We're going to get to a couple of listener questions. We're against the clock a little bit. We're going to get out of here soon. Again, this is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza, joined by my co-host, Scott Schulze. We had Matthew Cohen from Baltimore Beatdown, the SB Nation Ravens site, help us preview the upcoming game, the season opener. The Bengals host the Ravens at Paul Brown Stadium on Sunday afternoon. Hopefully you find a fun way to watch the game, an enjoyable way to watch the game. Hopefully you're safe, but have some fun. It's Bengals football, and this year appears to be more promising than last, for sure. We're going to get to a couple of listener questions before we get out of here. There was one I saw. It was from our friend Royal Flush 513. What about Michael Johnson playing a little bit of defensive tackle? To me, I think this makes a ton of sense. And to me, I think that the potential of some of these guys kicking – the guys like Carl Lawson and Jordan Willis coming in on third downs, on passing downs, coming off of the edge, gives the team flexibility to kick in a Michael Johnson, a Carlos Dunlap inside, maybe with Geno Atkins. Maybe you actually spell Geno Atkins. He is getting up there in age a tiny bit. So maybe you kind of just mix things up. But to me, this makes a lot of sense. And if you watched the game against the Redskins in the preseason, you would have seen Michael Johnson get a sack against the Washington Redskins starting offensive line from the interior on a third down. Your thoughts on Michael Johnson getting looks at defensive tackle? Obviously not a true defensive tackle by any means. I'm assuming this means passing situations, that sort of thing. Obviously, the wingspan and the reach also helps on passing downs when he's inside.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. I'd totally agree with looking at something like that, because I know they're not the exact same size, but Wallace Gilberry, we did something like that with him, and they may be looking. I know Gilberry and I think Chris Smith are similar sizes. I don't know if that would be another option they might look at, because you're looking at third and long in a pure pass situation, unless they run a dump off screen or something or a draw play. You're trying to get the quarterback. You're trying to get your best guys there. Someone like Pat Sims probably isn't going to be confused for J.J. Watt, kicking inside, getting to the quarterback that way. So if you he's tall enough, he can probably bat some balls down, lined up in the middle, kind of like Lawson or Dunlap does on the outside. So I would have no objection to it. He's probably a better pass rusher than Pat Sims or Andrew Billings at this point in their careers. And we've done things like that in the past. Other teams have done it. I don't see any as a fan, I don't see any reason not to do it. I don't know if there's anything, team-oriented locker room scheme where they would say, it's a dumb idea, fans don't know what they're talking about. But from the outside observer perspective, it seems like something that makes sense, because you want your four or five best pass rushers on the field in those situations. And if you think he can do it better than one of your guys who normally lines up a defensive tackle, why not try it and see what happens?
And while the Bengals, I mentioned earlier, they don't blitz often in terms of bringing additional pressure. They like to bring four. I think they're one of the lowest percentage in terms of defenses that blitz extra players. They try and find talented pass rushers that can win one-on-one battles, can get through double teams, and that's largely who they have. Geno Atkins can do it. Carlos Dunlap often does it. And now you've seen a lot of good things this preseason from Carl Lawson and Jordan Willis. So, I think they're going to do that. And what they like to do by getting those types of players is they like to mix and match. They like to spell certain players. And if you look back to 2013, 2014, 2015, when the team's defense was top notch, they did a lot of rotational stuff up front. They did a lot of they still had their best players in there often and very frequent in terms of Atkins and Dunlap, but they moved things up. They got creative and without needing to blitz necessarily, right, Scott?
Yeah, and that's and you look at who they have a defensive tackle. I mean, at least where he's at in his career right now, Billings, Sims, Ryan Glasgow, none of them are probably going to start the year making you, as an offense scheme, we have to stop this guy from getting to the quarterback. So if you have someone else you can put in there, and one thing they always say with Michael Johnson is, he's great against the run, he just can't rush from the outside. Okay, you're still kind of covered in the run if they do a draw play or something, and if he can get the quarterback a little better, then I think we have to, whatever we have to do to get, and I've kind of preached this on the offensive side too, whatever you have to do to get your five best offensive linemen on the field. And if it's not, Bodine, you have to find someone else that can play center to get your five best people there. And same thing on defense. When it's a pass rush situation, you want to have your 4 or 5 best guys because they aren't blitzing. And when they do blitz, I don't know if it's the scheme, they tend to get picked up more often than not. And then the quarterback usually finds the open guy and get burned. And so I think that's maybe conditioned them not to blitz as much. And I think we saw it in the Super Bowl when Atlanta was doing really well in the first half before they decided to, give that game away. They were getting pressure with their front four. And if you can get pressure with the front four, you can do all sorts of things in the NFL. And that's the key. So whatever you can do to get your pressure from the front four. It doesn't have to be the 4 guys that started. It has to be the 4 guys that, hey, on this play, these are the 4 best pass rushers right now in this rotation that are going to be in on this particular play. And if that means moving Johnson inside, then yeah, you move him inside.
Yeah, I'm really interested not only to see, because the Bengals got rid of some of those guys that were versatile pieces up front. Marcus Hardison, a guy who played an edge rusher in college and was labeled a defensive tackle with the Bengals. Wallace Gilberry, a guy who was an edge rusher that also moved inside on passing downs. So I'm really interested to see kind of what the Bengals do up front with some of these guys. And I'm really excited to see what Jordan Willis can do. Not that I'm not excited about Carl Lawson, but Jordan Willis, I said this on a Facebook Live post that I did. I think that Jordan Willis, you can make the argument that he was one of, if not the best Bengals player the entire preseason. Now, preseason, we all know, doesn't mean a lot, but he was a guy that went up. He still was going up against starters, second stringers. He wasn't going up against just scrubs. Had 4 sacks this preseason, 1 sack per game, multiple pressures. On the other hand, Carl Lawson, too, had some plays, and he made a nice play against Trent Williams, an all-pro left tackle for the Redskins, forced what ended up being an intentional grounding, what should have been a sack. So I'm excited for those 2 guys. Aren't you, Scott?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things. You look at OTAs and training camp before the preseason games. It was all Lawson, and then the game started. You're like, wow, this guy isn't the freak that Lawson is, but Willis is a really good player when you put the pads on and you go against these guys. And I know PFF was really big on both those guys for whatever that's worth coming into the draft. And Bengals fans generally were pretty happy we got both of them because it addressed the need and they seem to be good values. So you just kind of hope that the Bengals figure a way to put them on the field. And I think they probably will. But when you see the depth chart and you see Michael Johnson as the starter and ahead of both of them, it kind of makes you wonder, well, are they going to put him out there? Is it more of the same? I think preseason spoke volumes. Training camp did that. Hey, these guys can play. It wasn't against ones, but you have to put them out against ones. And you say Trent Williams, obviously they did go up against some ones, and when they were out there, they did really well. And so if our offense can get leads, force teams to throw, and if we can get this pressure, there's no reason to think that they can't be a solid pass rushing team, which we weren't last year.
Yep, and that's a good segue into our last question of the night from Matthew Lawless. I'm not completely sure as to what he's referring to here, but he asked the question, do any rookies win more snaps this week? I mean, it's not going to be one in practice, if that's we talked about Allen Iverson recently too. Practice. It's not going to be one in practice this week or anything like that. It would have been one in preseason. This is a team, we've talked about it a lot, Scott. This is a team and a coaching staff that really really likes its veterans, really likes the steadiness it gets from veterans. It's a weird dichotomy because they like the veterans, they like the steadiness, but they prefer the draft. They prefer to build the draft and get these young guys. It's kind of a weird philosophy to me, but I think obviously the Bengals are comfortable with their veteran guys up front, Dunlap, Johnson, and Atkins, for better, for worse, especially with Johnson for a lot of people. But, I think, at least I hope, that this preseason really opened the eyes of the coaching staff in terms of what Willis and Lawson can do. I think there were times where Margus Hunt impressed in the preseason, Dante Moak impressed in the preseason, but it wasn't to the same consistency. It wasn't against the same talent as what we saw from Willis and Lawson. To me, and when they weren't getting sacks, it was pressure. Now, that doesn't mean that Willis should be starting against Johnson per se. Some people believe he should. But I think that some of these guys should be getting more looks on defense and not just special team snaps. One other guy before I kick it to you, Scott, that was kicked around a lot, and he's really the only day, I believe, one of the few day 3 picks. I guess if you go rounds 4 through 7, one of the only late round picks, Jordan Evans, who made the team based on the other guys who were cut or on IR. That's a guy that's being talked about a lot in the YouTube chat as well. A guy who did a lot in the preseason to show that he could play linebacker and really was physical.
Yeah, and I think if we're looking at someone who, I guess we're looking at a rookie who we think could wow the coaches in week one and earn more playing time. We've talked about both Lawson and Willis. Unfortunately, I guess I'm jaded from the whole Carlos Dunlap experience when for his first year or two, every time Carlos Dunlap went out there, you're like, wow, this guy's really good. This guy's really good. The next week, it was Robert Gather starting. Robert Gather's getting 80% of the snaps. Dunlap would go in occasionally. Wow, this guy's really good. So I'm not quite ready to say they would have a chance. So I guess the one guy I'm thinking, and he's a rookie as far as playing time, not so much by draft year, would be William Jackson III. Even though he's not listed as a starter, I think once they see him go out there and see what he can do, I'm assuming he's going to end up with more snaps than Denard playing opposite Kirkpatrick. He's someone that I think there's probably enough athletic ability, enough natural feel for the position. Obviously, I'm projecting because we haven't really seen him play in a real NFL regular season game. He's one who I think could impress enough, especially with AJ or with Adam Jones aging. The team could say, hey, we have something with this first-round pick we made last year. Let's not do the Drake Kirkpatrick thing, keep him on the bench for 3 years. Let's make this guy a starter, or at least give him substantial playing time, rotate him in frequently with our, really old, multiple arrested cornerback, and make this, transition him to being a starter with Drake Kirkpatrick, who signed long-term, so that going forward, we have these two young guys, both locked up for the next 3-4 years, whatever, as our big, tall, athletic corners of the future. So he's one I could see, but yeah, he isn't a veteran, so you never know.
Yeah, I'd like to think that some of these young guys are going to get more snaps. And again, this is we talked. I mentioned earlier about the dichotomy between the Bengals' philosophy of the draft and veterans and all that kind of stuff. There's also a weird dichotomy of Marvin Lewis in wanting to see a player, quote unquote, practice the right way, and also, a former coach that I am, you also know that there are guys who just plain perform better in game situations than they do in practice. And they're, the gamers, if you will. And, there's a fine line to walk. And when you see, maybe Jordan Willis wasn't the greatest practice player, but when he got on the field, he just performed. So, I don't know. I think in the fact that Marvin Lewis doesn't have a contract extension, the fact that he's in his last year might signal the fact that he might be a little more open to, hey, let's get the best guys on the field regardless of who they are. You mentioned the running backs earlier. That was a point I wanted to bring up. It's going to be obviously they want to get the ball in the hands of Hill, Bernard, and Mixon. Hill and Bernard have had roughly 200 to 250 or so touches a year since they've been with the Bengals, total touches. And behind them, Burkhead's had the occasional touch, but not really much of anything. So it's going to be interesting to see how they end up splitting all that up now with Mixon, who could very well be the best of all of them in terms of amount of touches and all of that. So, there's a lot to sort out. I would like to think that the Bengals will be more open to letting the young guys get more snaps. We'll see if that's actually the case. Scott, let's get out of here with maybe some by the way, Nate McGuire in the YouTube chat says William Jackson is my baby. So he must be a big William Jackson fan. Let's get out of here with some predictions. I'm gonna talk about I'm going to kind of go off of what Matt said, and obviously this is going to be a tight game. I think there's I hate to kind of keep saying the same thing over and over again, but this is a game that I think that it is a game that it's always with the series, expect the unexpected, whether it's the Hail Mary, whether it's a big play. This is a game that could be a chess match, early on, and the Ravens really like to play the field goal game. And we talked about Justin Tucker and all that stuff, and they should, because they have a great kicker. But you got to wonder if it's going to be, at some point, especially with kind of some new pieces on offense, the offensive line for the Bengals, all that kind of stuff. Is this going to be a 13-10 game going into the fourth quarter? And then all of a sudden there's touchdown. I don't know. I'd like to think that the Bengals pull this one out. I'd like to think that it's a home opener. It's the first time they've opened at home for a while. They have two games at home right away on this schedule, which is nice. I'm going to say I'll go 21-16 Bengals for this week. And I say 21 probably because I don't think Randy Bullock has a wonderful game as the team's kicker. Scott, what do you think?
I think picking a score is almost like picking the type of train that's going to go through town next. That being said, you probably have a little better feel, and I'm going to go with Bengals 17-13. And I'm going to say Tucker has a couple field goals. They get a touchdown somehow, either one the tight ends, because we as we mentioned earlier, the linebackers and safeties aren't there to cover them. They probably get one in that way. But I'm going to say our defense probably stops smothering that. Their pass game, I don't think is going to be fully functional. So I'm going to say their touchdown probably comes that way. Probably, tight end somehow gets loose over the middle, gets a touchdown in the red zone. Tucker gets a couple field goals, probably one right before half. I think Bullock will make one. I think he probably goes 1-2, makes a field goal for us somewhere in the first half probably, and then we probably get a couple touchdowns. I'm going to say Green gets one because he always scores against the Baltimore Ravens. And I'm going to say Hill probably knocks one in from a yard out on like a 3rd and 1. So I'm going to say 17-13.
Okay. We'll get out of here on that. 17-13 from Scott. I had 21-16. We'll see who's right next week. We'll be breaking down the week 1 matchup between the Ravens and the Bengals on next week's show. We will also, we're hoping to have a guest. Keep in mind that the Bengals play the following week on Thursday. So just so you know, our scheduling may be a little funky this next week. We'll let you know if we end up recording live at a different night and time. Probably not going to happen as of yet. If it does, it will either be Tuesday night or it will be our standard Wednesday night that we normally do. We'll let you know through our social media and all of that going forward. Thank you so much for tuning on Cloud on YouTube. All of our content is available on cincyjungle.com. And you can get in touch with the program on Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. For Scott Schulze, I'm Anthony Cosenza. This has been the Orange and Black Insider. Thank you so much. Have fun week 1. Let's get a win. Let's start the season 1-0 and then host the Texans on Thursday Night Football. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.